what I would say is, look, I'm not an expert in messaging. I'm not even an expert in criminal law, right? I'm an expert in classification.
Well, let me ask you
And
about
so,
that. I
yeah,
want to ask you about
please.
classification. So one of
Yeah.
the questions I got on the show from listeners, and I'll take your call, we'll take your calls at 866-967-6887, is how common is it for vice presidents to take home classified documents? Meaning, a lot of people were suggesting, well, the president, of course, the president would have to take it. And the president has declassification powers, et cetera, which I don't know how it's particularly relevant since Trump hasn't even claimed that he declassified anything officially. But when it comes to a vice president, a lot of people were thinking, well, why would the vice president have these kinds of highly classified documents at his home at all? Talk to us about that.
Well, sure. I mean, vice presidents, depending on their portfolio and the issues they work on, are quite likely to be working on issues, matters that are classified. I mean, vice presidents will routinely work on, issues of foreign relations, right? I mean, we have Kamala Harris, in charge of sort of immigration with talking to Mexico and other countries, and some of that may actually involve some classified information. So, depending on the vice president's substantive portfolio, there may be, a large amount of classified information that the vice president is working with every day. The reason to take home classified information is not because you might need to declassify it, right? I mean, that would make no sense. You would declassify it before you took it home. And also I should mention, Vice President also has authority to declassify documents who had original classification authorities, and there are about 2,000 of them. All of them have the authority to declassify documents
Wait,
that
talk
they
to us.
have classified. Yeah, sure.
Talk to us about that.
So the authority to classify documents resides primarily, or sort of in the first instance, in the president. And the Supreme Court has held that is sort of a concomitant to the president's Article 2 powers to protect national security. So the president has that authority. Every president, except for Trump, has issued an executive order that governs how this works. And part of that order is a delegation of the authority to classify documents and to declassify documents to people who are then called original classification authorities. Now, what happens in practice is that this authority is delegated to cabinet agencies or to cabinet members, the heads of agencies, et cetera, also the vice president, and then they in turn are allowed to sort of sub-delegate to officials below them. And all in all, there are roughly, as far as the latest statistics we have, roughly about 2,000 officials in the U.S. government who have the authority to classify documents. They also have the authority to declassify documents. Now, documents are supposed to be declassified by the original classification authority who classified them in the first instance, or by their successor, or by one of their supervisors. But the fact remains that there are 2,000 people who have the authority.
So just so I understand that, so to have the power to declassify, do you have to have been the person or entity that had classified said document in the first place?
No, not necessarily. But that is sort of the first person who you would look to who has the authority to declassify that. But it could certainly be their successor if that person is no longer in office. And it could be a supervisor or somebody in the line of supervision of that person.
But if you're vice president, I mean, one of the arguments that a lot of people, particularly those who support Donald Trump, have been making is, well, Donald Trump can declassify anything, and as a result, that gives him much more leeway to take anything home. Now, I've shot down that argument a number of times because he's not even claiming he declassified this stuff in court. He's not claiming it. There's been no formal argument apart from on social media where he has suggested that he actually declassified anything. But are you saying that the president and the vice president, in theory, have, it's not equal, is it, in terms of the ability to declassify?
It's not equal insofar as the vice president only has that authority, which has been delegated by the president, whereas the president has pretty much plenary authority. However,
did Obama give, in the Obama administration, was there an executive order that would have afforded Vice President Biden the ability to declassify almost anything?
Not to my knowledge. not
Okay.
almost anything. I think it's kind of a straw man, right? That's not really at issue in this case.
I got it, but it's this theoretical. I'm interested in theoretically. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no. I mean, so the executive order that was in place under President Obama, as I said, makes the vice president an original classification authority. So he has, in that sense, the same authority as the president to classify information. In terms of declassification, what the executive order says is that information should be declassified by the people who I mentioned. Now, and there's another category too, which is officials who have been delegated this authority in writing by the agency head or a senior agency official in the originating agency. So it's quite a large group of people. To the extent the vice president would fall under, within that group in any given instance, I mean, you'd have to look at the specific situation.
And again, I'm just interested in this. So the specific situation that to determine whether this particular situation is applicable as to the vice president, as to what the vice president can and can't declassify on his own, and we'll be specific here in terms of what Vice President Biden at the end of his term can or couldn't or could declassify. What are you looking for in terms of the factors there?
So again, it would be whether or not the vice president could declassify the information pursuant to the executive order would depend on, whether he was a supervisory official of the person who classified the information, or if he had been delegated that authority in writing, which, to your point, it's not, I don't have any reason to think that President Obama had issued something in writing delegating specific declassification authority beyond what he would otherwise have under the order to Vice President Biden. Now, of course, the issue with Trump and his alleging that he had declassified these documents is that he was basically saying that he could declassify documents just by thinking about them. And that's just kind of a misunderstanding of what the word declassification means.
Right.
It's not, declassification is the process of removing protections for information, and protections aren't removed if you just think about something. So,
and also because there's an effect, there's an impact of that, right? It impacts all the other people who may have access to said documents as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
The reason that there's a process in place is because the classification of documents isn't supposed to just apply to one person. That the entire departments need to know. There has to be some,
Right, because otherwise the protections will still be in place. So you really haven't declassified it. It's sort of like saying that you've ordered food at a restaurant when you've thought about what you wanted, but you didn't tell the waiter. Right. You haven't really ordered food at that point.
Yeah, it's a little different, but look, the bottom line is that, the Trump argument about declassification is nonsense. It's just that theoretically, it's interesting. I didn't even realize until you just said
and I'm like, yep. And I'm like you. I'm interested in all these things, so I could talk about them forever. But I agree, it's really not relevant to the current situation. I think a much, much more relevant factor is this issue of overclassification and the effect that it's having on the classification system and on protection of national security secrets. I think that's...
Let me ask you, so I've got to take a break. We've got tons of people who are trying to weigh in. The call line's already full. But tell us, because I think this is something that is an issue as well, which is overclassification. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so overclassification, which is basically the classification of documents that don't really require protection in the interest of national security, is rampant in the federal government. And that's a fact. It's not my opinion. And it's not even contested. Government officials, former and current, have all acknowledged this. They have estimated that anywhere from 50 to 90% of classified documents could safely be released. And, there are a lot of harms that flow from this. And, some of them might be more obvious, such as, the public can't sort of engage in democratic debate about issues that are kept secret. And there are rule of law problems, because you can't hold the government accountable for misconduct if that misconduct is shielded by classification. But there are national security harms as well. And you do hear people talk about overclassification impeding information sharing, right, within the government and even outside of government. And that is a major concern. But there's another concern that's directly relevant here, which is that when so much information is needlessly classified, the burden of protecting all that information can become overwhelming. You can look at any given case and be like, well, yeah, you shouldn't keep it in your garage. You should keep it at, sure. But if you ask any national security official, properly marking every paragraph in every text or email, moving any conversation that might possibly involve a passing reference to classified information into a secure facility, doing all of your work on these secure systems without regard to whether you might need to travel or be at home with your family, that, you know, all of these protections can become their own full-time job. And that burden leads busy officials to cut corners. And they can rationalize this because they know that a lot of the information is not all that sensitive, but some of it is, right? And so the fear is that the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And so we have this situation where it is, I mean, nearly impossible, I think, depending on how much, you know, how routinely you deal with classified information, to ensure consistent compliance with all of the rules and all of the procedures for handling classified information, because it is just such an overwhelming amount. And if
is there going to be any
yeah.
effort to change that? I mean, is there going to be any political muscle to move the needle on that?
I hope so. My fear is that these recent revelations are going to lead to calls to actually add to the existing procedures for protecting classified information, which is obviously just going to make the problem worse, right? But we do know, we know that from reports from last summer that the Biden administration has been working on an executive order to govern classification. And this has been underway for a while. Every president issues one of these, as I said. I mean, Trump was the exception. So it's not like it was some special undertaking by this administration. And for that reason, I am certainly hoping, because this is part of the regular business of an administration, I'm hoping that these recent events won't sort of derail that effort. That is the best hope we have, because classification, for the most part, is governed by executive order. I mean, Congress could step in. It's very unlikely to do so.
Everyone I have talked to who's in the national security field in different ways says the same thing about overclassification. I mean, you literally talk to just about anyone, and they will tell you that they think that there is an issue with this. Liza, can you stick around and take some phone calls?
Absolutely.